Hey everybody, welcome to Art with Lisa. We have a super exciting class here today, and I can't wait for you to join me. Today we're going to talk about the secrets every successful artist knows. It's a simple class. All you're going to need today is a pencil, a ruler, and an eraser, and some paper. So let's get started. Everybody wants to know, how do you know how to do that? I wish I were an artist. You must have been born that way. Well, we talked about this. I don't really know if that's true or not. But over the 25 years that I've been a professional artist, I've learned some things that I want to share with you. And I think these are basic concepts that can be learned by anybody. Some of us are maybe born more observant, or we know how to see things clearly, observe things, catalog things, maybe watch a little more. But if you aren't born with that ability, you can certainly learn it. And here's the things I want to teach you. The first one is literally how to see. Our eyeballs are our best friends. Some of us use them more intensely than others to look at things, to notice that when we look at a tree, we're not just seeing a tree as people would represent a tree if they were asked to draw a tree, but we're noticing the imperfections, the fact that there's more on one side than the other, the bulk of mass and form and light and shadow, and how things are affecting it around the tree itself, and lots of different little pieces and parts that as an artist you're noticing when you're looking at something. That is what makes us able to represent something. So I want to teach you how to see. It's really the most important part of becoming an artist. The second thing are shapes, and they're very basic. We know that. We learn them from the time we're children. We understand what a square is, a circle, a triangle, a diamond, a long rectangle. We have these little games where we put them into the right hole in our little toy, and we pick them up and we put them in our mouths, and we learn that, oh, it's not just a flat thing. There's form to this, and there's actually substance to it, and these are the sides of it, and this is the top and the bottom. And then as we get older, if we become an artist, then we start to see how things go together, a triangle on top of a square. And here's how, when we do perspective, this is what happens to it. And here's where the door would be. And when you do windows sideways and they go away from you, they get smaller and smaller. And all of these little things that we learn as an artist become what we can refer to or what we can draw on in our brain when we're trying to replicate something. So shapes is the next thing. The third thing is values. Oh, it sounds like a big scary word, but it's really not. It's the difference between light and dark. And when a light shines on something and it's projecting a light onto an object, say we have a long block here, and the light is coming down on it, where the light is, where the light hits it, it is the lightest, and the further away something goes from the light source, the darker it gets, until there is no light whatsoever on it. So a lot of people would call this shading. Artists call it values. The ability to see the light, medium, and dark tones on a subject. The fourth one is line. Sounds really simple. When you draw something, we draw a line to represent what that is. But when you want something to look realistic and you draw it, you may or may not leave the line all the way around. Maybe you just do lines around the darkest part of it. And as you start to shade, or as you start to turn it into something real, then those lines disappear. And we don't see the lines on the outside edge. So there's lots of different ways to draw and represent. Cartooning, or obviously there's lots of different kinds of art representation, but when you're wanting something to look very realistic, you don't always see the lines all the way around it. They may disappear, and because our mind knows that that's a ball, or we understand that that has form, our brain fills in the rest of it, and we don't have to have all the lines around there. We can look at something like this and know that it actually is a sphere, but it doesn't need all the lines. And the fifth one is color. And color is something that speaks to a lot of people. Everybody loves to see color. We like to put it into things. We like to have it in our pictures. We like color photography. We like color paintings. Obviously, there's room for all different facets of art. Some people do everything in black and white or grayscale, pencil, but if you are a lover of color, it's really exciting to learn the color wheel, the precepts, the basics of primaries and secondaries and tertiaries and quaternaries, and oh, it all sounds complicated, but really, once you know the basics of all these things and you know how to put them together, you can become a better artist. But I have taught thousands of students over the years, and what I will continue to tell all of them is you cannot be a good painter. You cannot be a good sculptor. You cannot sketch well. You cannot do any of this well until you learn how to draw. The most important thing. And how do you learn how to draw? You must begin with being able to see things like an artist. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Those are the 5 secrets I've put together. Fairly simple, but if you were to look at something this simple, you would say, oh, there's a cone, a ball, and a cube. Really? Yes, it's a triangle, a circle, and a square. But to give them form, we start looking at shapes. This is not a square. On top of the square, it has a whole different shape. And this line doesn't intersect this line in the back corner. So I have to look at the shape of the top of it. And when a box is turned sideways, it's not a perfect square. It turns into different angles. And when something else is in front of it, oh, we lose part of that shape behind there. And again, from here to here. And then when light comes into the picture and we're seeing a light source brought onto something, it creates a lighter surface and a darker surface. And when it's on a white surface itself, then the light is reflected up onto the object. And all of those things our brain is taking in as making it look like it's real. Like you could just reach out and pick up that ball and toss it out of the scene. To be able to draw this, you have to be able to see it first, and that's what I want to teach you. So we're going to go through some examples here of things that I want you to see. Let's start with faces. Everybody loves faces. Everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of you want to draw faces. You've loved how people have done portraiture, and you're just enamored with how somebody can replicate somebody's likeness. Well, let's start to look at what an artist looks at when they see a face. Very recognizable figure, Albert Einstein. So there's some very simple things about him that you would notice as an artist. Obviously, his hair was a big part of his personality and who he was. When I start looking at his face, I'm going to look at the shape of his face. And that's what I would start with if I were drawing. If I'm just going to go in here and draw shapes of his face, then I'm looking right away at where the light and shadow is. Here's another shape right here. This is the side of his face. Sideburns there, ear comes down, and here's some part of his chin. Shoulders coming down from here, neck of his coat. This hair, look at this hair. I could just draw the shape of that hair and give myself a realistic representation of Albert Einstein. It was wild, it was crazy, it went everywhere. And so I'm just literally going in and looking at the shape of that face. Where are his eyes according to the rest of him? I'm going to be measuring all the time. If I were to make this shape right here, where do his eyes lie? Well, little bit above center. So if I were to put them in here, I would measure a little bit above center, and that's where I would put those eyes. Same with his nose. His face is turned to the side. So this shape right here, the side of his face, is what it would be centered on. Not the whole face, because his ear is showing over here, but it's not showing on the other side. So when I'm measuring, I'm going to use this shape in here to measure where everything on his face goes within here. Bulbous nose, kind of a rounded, very rounded nose. So I'm looking at shapes here, and I'm drawing just shapes to begin with. He has those creases, big mustache. The mustache takes up quite a bit of his lower face there. So I just put that shape in, a little bit of chin. He's got a little bit of a dimple here in his chin. All this is shadow over here. So I'm just looking at shapes right now before I do anything else. Very high forehead, and it disappears. The light on this photo says there is no delineation between his hairline and where that forehead starts. Eyebrows, small but expressive. And so I'm measuring all the time. I'm looking at where is this from here to here and side to side. That's how I'm measuring when I look at a face. So really, I'm just starting out with the shapes, the shape of his hair, the shape of his face, shape of his eyes. Same thing when you look at a young child. Babies literally have most of their features on the bottom half of their face. Look at that. There's the whole skull, a large kind of rounded off square, and everything from his eyebrows down is on the bottom half of his face. That's because their skull, their features are not finished growing. They don't usually have a lot of hair, so we're seeing a big part of the skull up there. Big eyes, not very defined features yet because they're all still so soft and malleable. They haven't really gotten a lot of, they've just got cheeks and eyes, a little bit of a nose, tiny little ribbon mouth. The ears are there, but to begin with, I'm looking at shapes and where they are on that child's face. Then I would start measuring. I'm noticing as an artist that if I were to draw a line across the top of his ears, well, it also goes across the top of his eyes. Then from here, if I'm going to measure top of the eyes is basically the top of the nose down to here. If I'm to half that space again, it would come to the bottom of his nose. And from here, from the bottom of his nose to his little chin, this baby, halfway again, would be his mouth. So measuring, comparing, looking at the whole face as a whole and how things work on the inside as I am drawing. Now, we'll look at a lady's face. Very short contemporary haircut. Her head is tilted to the side. But again, I start measuring. I'm looking at the shape of this face, kind of rectangular at the top, comes down, maybe a triangle here at the bottom. So if I were drawing this, I would be adding, I would start out with that shape of a face, and I've got that little bit rounded of a top of the forehead, comes down on the sides, cheekbones here, and then it comes to the chin at the bottom. So I start out with my rectangular shape here. If I were to just draw a rectangle, and then on the bottom of it, I'm adding a triangle, but it's off center and it comes to this side because her face is tilted to the side. So I'm just wanting you to start seeing what I'm noticing as an artist. Shape of the hair around the top here. I'm doing the top edge. I'm just seeing how it bisects, how this hair shape goes over the top of that triangle. So I'm not actually seeing the whole triangle. It's disappearing in here. I'm just seeing the shape of that hair coming down, almost looking at where it ends at the bottom. If I were to draw a line across, I see, oh, the bottom of the hair actually goes right across the top of that bottom lip. And so measuring all the time. That's how I'm establishing what the shape is of this. I'm noticing that, again, if I were to draw a triangle, or excuse me, a rectangle here, this is where all of her features are. This over here is the side of her face that goes to her ear, and that would not be included in my measurements on the face. So that's how I want to observe that. If I'm looking at somebody's profile, same thing. This is a man's face. Men are much more angular usually. So I would go in here and I would see this rectangle Really, it starts with a rectangle coming straight down, and there's a small triangle on the front of it that encases everything from his hairline down to his chin and over. Then I would start measuring. About halfway down his head would be the top of his ears, and for this gentleman, right through about the middle of his eyes. Because I'm only drawing one eye, I don't have the reference of the other one, but I'm looking at the brow bone and where it comes down, when it indents, and then the nose comes out from that. If I'm drawing a straight line down, I'm seeing that it intersects from the top of his forehead, then it goes to the side of his nose, then it comes down to the side of his mouth, and then to the middle of that area on his chin. So this is how you start to observe things. Then I'm going to say, all right, between this rectangle here, if I were to half this face, then really all of his features are on the left side of the rectangle, and his ear and to the back of his head would be the right half of it. Now here's another perspective to look at someone. There are no eyes showing. You're not seeing a lot of the nose. The mouth is closed, so this is all just the suggestion of those things. If I were to draw this shape here now, it'd be like a long oval. And if I were to half it again, the whole entire top half of this oval is her hair. All of her features are in the bottom half. If I line it up here symmetrically, usually people's faces are quite symmetrical, and you can see that right down the middle of her face, I'm going to draw a plumb line here. It would bisect the middle of her nose, the middle of her mouth, middle of her chin. So measuring all the time. It would be the same thing when you're talking about animals. Whether you're drawing a close-up portrait of a horse's eye or the whole body, you are going to be looking at shapes. I don't want you ever during these classes to just come in and think, well, I know what a horse looks like. I know what a dog looks like, and draw it out of your memory. The whole point of this class is to teach you how to see shapes. To come in here and look at this and see this horse's eye is one big almond shape to start with. If I'm going to be drawing, I'm not just going to go in. You can't draw an eyeball like a real eyeball and have it look right on the side of this horse's face. This is on the side of his head, and really the whole entire shape can be encompassed in what looks like almost an almond shape. And in the top of that almond shape is another triangle that's kind of curved for his eyelid. And within that then comes down the bottom eyelid, and here's another little crescent shape. And above that would be the bump right above his eyelid that goes up to his brow bone. There's lots of anatomy here I won't get into with horses, and then his eyelashes are literally a shape. They come like this. And so I'm giving myself, just to begin with, all the shapes that I'm seeing. And that's what I want you to start noticing. And that's what, after we do this class, I would love you to practice just finding different photographs, and don't worry about making them look realistic. I want you to just go in and start copying shapes. Same thing with the dog. Look at this darling Labrador. If I'm looking at his head, really basic shapes. I've got a triangle basically here from the tops of his skull down to really where the top of his lip is. Within that, there's another one that comes down. This would be more rectangular, that would encase his whole skull. Two little triangle ears on the side, bisecting down the middle, measuring where, if I were to make this a full shape, where is the halfway line going this way, going that way, bisecting it again. Those kind of measurements are what you start to see when you are an artist. Now the dog's in motion. I don't just draw a running dog with legs all askew. I am looking at the shapes of this animal. Look at this big long triangle here, the shape of its upper body. And from there, it intersects with another oval in this back muscle on the upper leg. And from there, I'm seeing more shapes, more shapes. So literally, you could go in and just start drawing these shapes and noticing where they intersect with each other. We start with that triangle. From here, we've got an oval coming down that's connected to that triangle. From there, we've got a little bit of a curved, the neck here, just say it's a curved rectangle that goes on. From that comes the head, and it goes rectangles again. I'm just noticing shapes, and ear is flopping up. The ear is a big triangle. From here, I'm noticing that the legs kind of form a triangle. And so I draw that in, and then from there, then I can start going into anatomy. But when you without knowing incredible anatomy, if you are a medical illustrator, you'd have a lot of this already in your mind. Otherwise, you can render the same kind of things just by the power of observation and what you're seeing and what you're noticing on an animal. So again, I'm just looking at shapes. I'm just replicating shapes. I've never drawn a Dalmatian before. I don't really know what their body shape looks like, but I can notice what I'm seeing. And when I draw that and I see where lines go, bottom of the paw goes about to this joint here. Am I getting that correct? I'm coming across. Yep. Then I've got another long triangle coming in here, almost even with the end of that tail. That's where that's going to break. And so this is the drawing process of an artist, just constantly measuring, comparing, looking at where something is in comparison to another. And you all notice it when you are looking at artwork and you're looking at things. You know when things don't look right, but you might not know why. And so I'm giving you the why. This is how you make sure that things, if you are wanting to draw things realistically or representationally, this is how you are looking at things. Again, we'll look at something very simple, maybe just a subject like a flower in a vase. Well, we've all seen a flower in a vase. I know how to draw a flower in a vase, but let's look at the lines. Look at the dimensions and the proportion. How big is the stem up here? 1, 2, 3 stems worth is the vase. So if I'm going to measure that, I could also say this dimension here is almost equal to this dimension here. So lots of cool ways to measure things as well. And with landscape, the same thing. I'm going to look at this picture and say, all right, if I'm going to replicate this, where is my halfway line through this picture? Well, the horizon line is a little bit above center. So that's the first thing I would measure out on my canvas or my painting when I'm doing that. And if I'm going to half this, because this road is pretty much going back into the distance from equal sides on both sides of this painting, I look at that. But where it converges, it's getting narrower and narrower, and the curve is all left of center before it goes back around. Same thing with these buildings. Beautiful perspective of architecture. If we were to look at these straight on, they would be rectangle, rectangle, rectangle. But because perspective, looking up, kind of skews things, now I have to start noticing where all these lines go and how they interact with each other. And architectural drawing is a whole nother facet of drawing. So I hope I've given you just a little peek into what I'm talking about when I say I want you to see things like an artist. All right, so we've looked at landscapes. One last example here is a butterfly. How would you draw a butterfly? If I told you to draw a butterfly, most of you would just draw a basic butterfly as you think of one, looking straight on. This is a butterfly shape that many of us know, and it's true. It's right on. But look at all the different ways a butterfly presents itself in flight to make it look realistic. And again, we're talking about shapes. We're looking at how things turn, and when something goes away from us, how it almost disappears to give us the idea that that wing is going out and away from us. When they're spread out and they're flying flat away from us, it flattens that triangle out. When they're to the side, all we really see is a full profile of one wing and then just a bit of the other. So it's really exciting. And when you start to notice things like this, you are going to start to draw things totally differently than you have before. So we're going to start today. Our lesson is going to be a very, very simple vase. Everybody knows this is a vase. By looking at it, you can tell that it's glass, but how do you draw glass? Really, there's nothing to explain about it. There's no substance to it. It's really just reflecting everything around it. And so we are going to talk about how to see that and how to draw that. So I mentioned a ruler just in case you are the measuring type and you want something to be exact. You could go in here and start measuring dimensions about how wide the opening is, how tall it is from top to bottom, how wide it is here, how wide it is on the whole paper. And you're welcome to do that. We may do a little bit of measuring as we're drawing here. But to start with, let's just look at the shapes and start comparing where things are relationally. So we see at the top that we have pretty much a long oval here lying on its side, a horizontal oval. That's the first thing I want you to notice. Now, there's also an oval on the bottom. Because of where we are seeing this one is more flattened than the one we see at the bottom, because our perspective is a little bit higher looking down into the vase. So the oval you see down at the bottom is a little bit rounder than the one at the top. And if I were to draw the whole oval in here, and I'll do that just so I can make my point. I'm going to put a piece of paper under here because marker goes through. So I've got my fairly flat oval here at the top, and I'm noticing that the oval at the bottom is much rounder. Do you see that? Same glass, and if you were to hold them up, you would see the same. They're both a circle. If you were to look down through the top of the vase, you would see this, basically, a little circle on the top and a big circle at the bottom of the vase, and that's looking straight down into the vase. But when you turn it to the side, this is how it changes our perspective. All right, now we've got another oval in here, and I'm just going to draw this so you can see it. This is like an egg shape that encases the whole entire thing. All right, so there's another oval, narrower at the top, wider at the bottom. Now, connecting all of those obviously is kind of a concave shape. I don't know what you would call this. If we squared off the ends, it would be a rectangle. But those are the shapes that intersect to give us the idea that we are making a vase. Now, how we go in and add the values to that will give us the representation and the realistic look of an actual vase. So let's get started. You need your pencil. And again, if you want a ruler, we can measure this out. You will have a template that you can download below. It's attached to this class. And I want you to get in the habit of looking at what you're drawing. So on the left side of your paper is going to be the vase, and that's what you will print out, and then you can draw this on a piece of paper. I'm taping mine so it will stay in one place while we're drawing here so you can see everything. So this is my reference. This is where I'm going to sketch. For those of you who would like to measure, I'll start out with that. And I see that my vase is about 5 1/4 inches tall. So I'm going to start with that. Let me get my paper settled on here. Put another piece of paper under here so I don't go through again. All right, so I'm going to measure here from the top, put a little hash mark at the top, and about 5 1/4 inches at the bottom. And that tells me my measurements. Now I'm going to measure this oval. And again, this is right at about 3/8 of an inch. So I'm going to give myself a little hash mark there. And width would be 1 3/4. So I'm going to start that right here. Give myself a little hash mark here. And 1 3/4 over here. And the widest part of this is about 2 1/2. So I'm just giving myself some general marks, and maybe the neck here is about 1 1/4. So you may want to come in and square this up first and draw your line down so you know where to bisect these from your little hash mark. And remember how I showed you in another lesson how to square when you're using a paper? You just take the top of your ruler and line it up against the top of the edge of your paper, and that will give you a perfectly square vantage point to start your lines from. So that tells me where the middle is. Now I kind of know how this is centered up, and if I were going to draw that on here, if I'm going to draw my line straight down from the top, again, whether you may or may not be interested in all this measuring. If not, you can just go ahead and sketch this in. But for those of you who like to measure, so I know that this is 1 3/4, and now I know that this goes in about 1/4 of an inch on each side. So I would go down a ways and mark 1/4 of an inch, come in 1/4 of an inch, mark that. And then it goes out from that line almost 3/8 on both sides. So from that line, I'm going to go out 1 2 3/8 here and 1 2 3/8 here. All right. So now I know top, sides, bottom, all the way around. But again, you don't have to measure this. If you just want to sketch along with us without all the measuring, that's fine. So I know that my oval, my long horizontal oval, is generally here. So I'm going to go ahead and sketch that in. And I would encourage you to sketch fairly light when you start, because we are going to have some disappearing lines. We're going to have some darker, some lighter. Now, remember I showed you the different shapes that we're being aware of as we draw here. We had an oval up here. We had a large egg shape on the bottom, and then within that egg shape we had another oval. So if you're the measuring type, you would go in here and say, all right, that measurement is right at about 2 inches from the top of my oval. So I would go in here and say right at about 2 inches is where my oval needs to start. And then I'm going to go from here to my outside marks and down to the bottom. So I will very lightly sketch this in, this egg shape from both sides. And this gives me my reference for the bottom. And the reason I'm doing all these measurements is because if you're wanting something to be an exact likeness and you can measure, by all means do measure, until you can train your eyes to do the measuring for you. This will help you get more realistic results. So now I know that this angle goes from the lip, the outside edge of my top lip, and then it curves into those little hash marks I made here, and then it comes back out to the side of my egg. So I'm going to start here. I'm going to go in, meet that little hash mark I made, and then come back out to the edge. Now I'm going to do the same over here. Into the hash mark and back out to the edge of that egg. Now for that bottom oval, I see that it's about 1 inch wide. So I'm going to go to the bottom of my vase and measure up 1 inch. And I know how to make an oval. So this one's going to be much rounder than the top one. And I'm just going to carry out to the edges, and that is generally the bottom of my vase. All right, so you've got the bones just like that, with a little bit of measuring and some comparing, noticing the shapes, breaking it down into shapes, and helping yourself see what you are drawing, not just going in there and saying, I know how to do a vase. Which, again, I'm not wanting to diminish anybody that has that ability, but for those of you that are really struggling with how to replicate something so it looks just like what you're drawing, these are the things that you need to start practicing And again, I would say if you're a beginner, start with really simple things like this vase. So you can start to learn, here's where an oval is, here's where a triangle is, here's where a square is, and I can draw those and I can put them together. And when I do that, this is what I come up with. So we've got our bones in here now. I can go in and erase some of my measuring lines out of here until I've got just the edges that I want for this. And like I said, you want your initial sketches to be fairly light so you can kind of lighten those up, especially at the top where we've got light almost doing away with the outline. And we can start doing the actual sketching. So let's look again at our picture and notice where the lines are heavier, where the lines are lighter. So now we've done the first thing that I talked about. You've learned how to see this correctly. Then you found the shapes in it. Now we're going to look at the values or the shading, where things are lighter and where things are darker to make this look realistic. So a great trick that artists often use when they're trying to see values, you really want to erase the color out of things to see value, the lights to the darks. So if you squint your eyes, by erasing out all of the picture that your optical understanding would take in of color and light and everything, you can squint your eyes and your eyelashes themselves make a natural filter that will kind of gray things down for you. And they'll help you see the lightest light in this whole entire picture is actually the bottom of the vase. And then it goes to this area up here, which is lighter behind, which is actually the color of the paper. If we were doing this on a gray or toned paper, we could exaggerate that. And then the darkest darks are just very minimal. They're very suggestive, just the very edges of this glass in places that help us understand that there's substance to this item. So we're going to start at the top here. And as you can see, very light. We're going very light. We're going to go in and just establish the edge of this. Now, we've talked about how to draw with a pencil before. And your options are to hold it like this, which is the standard way that you used to draw with, but you'll find sometimes that it's a little more complicated to shade and get a nice smooth shading when you have a thin pencil lead. Sometimes it's easier to sketch with an overhand where you can actually use the flat edge of the lead itself to do the shading. So experiment with that and see what you're most comfortable with. I'm going to turn it like this for sketching. And I'm just going in here very lightly, sketching a little darker the edge of this top left part of the vase, the lip of the vase. And obviously with glass, we're not going to have a sketchy edge. We want it to be a nice clean edge where we're working. So I'm going to try to pressure, more pressure where I want something to be dark, and then lighter pressure as I come away and I want the line to lighten. So if we're looking at this picture, you really can't even see the edge of that lip where the light is hitting it. So I'm going to go in and erase that out. And then I'm going to come over to this side and we can just see a little bit again on this edge, very light. I'm going to go in and just very lightly suggest that the density of this glass, and it's really because we're looking at it straight on that it's showing some more shadow there. And again, you want to be sure that your drawing is correct, because as I will continue to say, all the shading, all the values, all the color, all the paint is not going to fix a bad drawing. So really practice your drawing skills and getting the shapes correct before you start to go in and shade them. Make sure these are symmetrical sides on the top of this. Make sure you've got it centered from top to bottom. Really analyze your drawing before you start working further into it. Okay, now it seems like the light source is probably coming from the center and behind this because there's a shadow cast towards us. There's light showing in the back of this, and it's fairly even from side to side, the amount of shadow that we're seeing. So I'm going to start to come down this line here on the left-hand side, and if you're left-handed or right-handed, you may be starting on the other side. Because I'm right-handed, I kind of work from left to right, back away from my hand. And I'm just going to very lightly start to come down the edge of this and darken that in. And I'm noticing that there's a little wider depth to the line right here than there is when it gets down to this curve. So I'm going to try to replicate that in my sketching, that the line is a little bit deeper, and maybe it's because the glass is a little bit thicker. I don't really know right there, but that's what I'm going to replicate. And then I'm going to keep following that curve, and I'm trying to keep it a nice clean line because it's glass. We don't want any variation or bumps showing on here because glass would be very uniform as it comes down. Now, as I come down to this curve, I'm noticing that immediately this crescent starts to get bigger and it comes in a ways. So I'm going to establish where I'm going to come to down here at the bottom. And I would also notice that there seems to be a really thick bottom to this. So I may go ahead and go in here and draw that in. This is the bottom of the vase showing here. And it goes just kind of a crescent shape along the bottom. And this oval actually doesn't go all the way to the edges. Do you see that? The oval kind of stops almost 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the glass, which tells me that it is very thick glass at the bottom. So this is the inside of the vase, and it comes in from the edge there. So again, I'm just checking my symmetry from side to side of this drawing. Okay, so I start to come down here, and now I'm noticing that my crescent is going to come in and it's almost going to come to the edge of my oval. So I can start to curve that shading in as I come in from the edge of the glass. Okay, now it stops right here at a highlight, which is here's the bottom, that really thick glass at the bottom. And so there's a little tiny light reflection here that I see, and I'm going to put that in. I'm going to leave that in, and I know that my shading needs to stop right above that. And you will notice as you look at your reference picture how far this goes in, and that's what you're going to replicate. So I'm kind of showing the side edge now here of this. And the shadow actually comes all the way to the bottom, and then you see a bit of it below that little bit of highlight. And it is curved also because so many things with glass are curved the way light refracts through it. So I'm noticing that this little shadow here kind of stops in a curved shape. And when you get your reference picture, you will notice all these tiny little details. But this is exactly what I'm talking about when I say we are going to learn how to see. Every single little detail matters, okay? So now let's go to the right side. And I am noticing that there's a little bit less of a line on the right side than the left. Do you notice that? It's a little bit thicker over here, a little bit darker. So I'm going to keep that in mind as I'm coming down this side. I'm going to go ahead and shade it, but I want to keep comparing back and forth that I actually made this side darker and thicker, and I'm not going to go quite as bold on the other side. And again, that's just telling the story of the light. So our minds fill in all the rest of what the whys because of what we've learned about light and shadow. And our job as an artist is just to be very observant in all of these little details. So when we're finished, our mind says, yes, that looks real. So I'm coming down, and it's almost a fairly uniform line all the way. I'm not seeing much difference in width as I come down on this side. But again, as I get to this area, I notice that the curve again will come in almost to the edge of that oval, and it's not quite, I gotta be really observant of this little curve right here. That's what I'm trying to replicate here. So observing, measuring, looking at it. Is it even to the one across from it? Almost. It's a little bit lower, I'm seeing. So I'm going to go in and darken this now, and it is definitely the same density or value on this side that it was on the other side. Okay, and then smooth transition back up into this line. Remember, we're dealing with glass here. So we want nice, clean, smooth lines. All right, then again, I see a little bit of light reflected here at the bottom, so I'm going to leave that open. And I'm going to continue the shadow down on the side of it like I did on the other side. And then this line just kind of blends. This one just kind of fades away as it goes across there. So very lightly with my eraser, I'm going to put this line in. It actually goes across from one crescent shape to the other. And then real light shading underneath here where the light's kind of reflected through. And you can see that I have my pencil almost flat to the paper now for shading, and I'm holding it further back on the pencil. So I'm just very lightly shading that in now here at the bottom. And then the same over on this side. Really observing what those shadows look like, trying to keep my strokes directionally the same as they come across. But I'm noticing that the lightest light comes through here. It's almost the same as it is back here. So the shading actually goes from that oval up. So that's what I'm going to start working on now. The shading is actually on the other side of the vase. So very lightly, with very light uniform strokes, I'm going to start going across here and shading the other side of that vase in as it comes around. And you do want to kind of mimic the direction of the circle. So I don't want to come in here with straight across lines. I'm trying to tilt my pencil this way and then start to round it as it goes across. And one other reason that we like to draw further back on our pencil is when you're holding something this tight, your wrist can only turn so much and you only have so much control. When you do the overhand version or you hold further back on your pencil, you can engage your whole elbow and shoulder to get rotation and to change the direction of your strokes. So you get to use your whole arm instead of just be limited to how far your wrist can turn. So I'm just using very light back and forth strokes, kind of changing the direction of my pencil to help that blend in a little bit. And that just takes practice, learning how to blend with your pencil. And I'm noticing that it's gradating from here as it goes up. It gets lighter and lighter. If I squint my eyes down, I can see that it's darker down here and it starts to lighten as it goes up. So that's kind of what I'm shooting for here, is darker near the bottom of the vase, but as it goes up, I'm wanting it to get lighter and lighter. Now, I don't want it to be as light as this, so this still has to stay the lightest part of this whole picture. When you squint your eyes, you will see that nothing in this photograph of this vase is lighter than the base of that. So there has to be some shading all the way to the top of this. And you will, like I said, you're just going to have to practice how to shade with a pencil. back and forth directionally. You can overlap your strokes one over the other to try to smooth them out a little. One thing I didn't mention that you might want to have on hand for blending is called a tortillon. It's a blending tool. And if you don't have one, you can sure use a Q-tip, which is a common household item to have, but this is a blending tortillon, and you can go in, it's just paper, fiber, basically, that's rolled up, and they have it to a fine point, and you can blend with that, going back and forth over pencil or charcoal, both. It works for both. So very, very light. I'm just barely putting any graphite on this paper, but I do want it to be the slightest bit darker than the bottom of that vase. So you're going to go in and just start to do the same thing here, back and forth. I went diagonally to the left. Now I'm going a little bit diagonally to the right, trying to blend those pencil strokes in. And as I get closer to the bottom, I am adding a little more pressure so it gets a little bit darker. And keep squinting your eyes and comparing what you're drawing with your reference picture. Looking, looking, looking. Anytime you stop looking at what you're drawing, you are departing from the journey to making it look correct. When you start just depending on what you think you saw, you're very likely to be disappointed with what you end up with. So again, I'm just going back and forth, kind of measuring, squinting down, looking back and forth between the left one and the one that I'm drawing to see when I've got the right shading or values in on this. Okay, now if you wanted to, you could go back in with that tortillon and just blend that out so it's a nice smooth transition, and you'll see how easily that happens with these, that you can just go in and smooth out your strokes. And once these get graphite on them, then you kind of have to be careful when you go back in with them, because they become a drawing tool themselves. As you'll see, once you get graphite on there, you can go back in and actually draw with it because it's got some graphite on it. So I'm going in and just very lightly going over the top of all of this and just shading that in, blending it out, getting lighter and lighter as I get to the top. That's the glass. And we're starting to look more and more realistic. Okay, now we've just got a few details at the bottom to finish out the base of this. And this is where, again, we really want to look at what we're doing. All right, so we've got our really dark edges here, and then they kind of faded out as they came into the vase itself. So softening that edge along the side here with my blender or my Q-tip. Same down here. Go in and smooth that out and then blend it in. All right, now we can see that in the bottom, there's really just some suggestions that there's indentations in the bottom of this vase. So I'm gonna go in and just very lightly kind of reestablish the edge of that oval, but I don't wanna go in and put a solid line. I'm just gonna do some broken edges here, just here and there, to kind of go in and just very lightly along the edge of that, I want to darken that line to give me my eye, to convince my eye that there is an edge to that glass in there. Now there's a tiny little lip under there, and I see that it comes in maybe 1/8 of an inch parallel to the edge of that. And again, it's a very broken line. It's not solid. I'm just going to go in just a few places, maybe darker on the edge over here is what I'm seeing in my photo, and I'm going to put that in. Now on the front part, it's telling me that there's a center to this bottom and it must be flat. And so that's what glass does in this reflection is it would show just a little bit of shading to where the surface of whatever this is sitting on might be showing through. So it's kind of an abstract shape here. There's not really it's not an oval, it's not a crescent. I'm just imitating the shapes of what I'm seeing in the photo. Okay. And it's a little darker along this front edge. Observation, observation. I cannot say it enough. Draw what you see, not what you know. I'm noticing all these little lines in here, and that's what I'm going to go in and replicate. And really, again, it's only reflecting on the edges. We don't really see much on the inside of this. Now I can establish that I need to go back in here and darken these edges even more than what I had. So I'm going to increase my pressure and really bump up the values on the outside edge of this. Just on those two big crescents that come down from the side. Again, really clean edge line there, but I'm really adding pressure and darkening up the bottom of that as it comes down to the base. Then there's a little bit of that same really dark edge just along the outside, kind of curves in. And here, you're just going to be following along as you're looking to the reference picture and trying to notice what I'm noticing. I'm just talking you through what my eyes are seeing and what they're telling my brain. I'm seeing some more like a triangle of really dark shading over here. This might be a little more dark on this side, but it doesn't go all the way across. Now, to establish that this is sitting on something, I see that where the light stopped at the base of the vase, that's where the darkest dark of the shadow is. But look here, there's some light coming right through this and being reflected onto the tabletop. So I want to mimic that in my drawing. So I'm going to go in and try to copy the shape. Now, what is the shape here? It looks like kind of a little half circles on both sides. So I would go in and I see that it starts just below this little reflection here. So I'm going to come out with a little shape here, and same thing over here, right underneath this reflection, and be symmetrical because it would be exactly like this vase is. Maybe I went out a little too far there. Measure, like if I put a line straight up here, I see that it doesn't come out any further. It actually comes out in narrower than the edge of that vase on both sides. So if I'm going to measure here, I'm going to see that I don't want it to go quite out as wide as the vase is. And maybe I went too far on this side too. So again, measuring, measuring, measuring. So there I've got my shape. Now I see these are kind of two little, I don't know what those shapes are, but they don't go quite to the center, and they kind of come out like this on both sides. So I'm going to draw that in and give myself some reference. And then I'm going to go in, and I notice that there's one very bright highlight right in the middle, and then there's two little small highlights coming out the sides. So I'm going to remember that as I'm drawing here. I'm going to go right up under here with a very dark border, and then right along this edge over here, like I often explain in my some of my other drawing classes, where the darkest dark ends here is where the light kind of starts on the side. So my darkest dark ended here. The shadow and that reflected light started right underneath it. So I'm going to do a little correction on my shadow there. And then I see that the vase is darker than the shadow right there because of the reflected light under it. So I want to repeat that. I don't want to go that dark underneath here. The darkest dark is actually here in the front, right up against the light that's being reflected. So I'm just going to go in and kind of fill this in now, being aware that I'm leaving that little bit of light over here. And again, this kind of fades out, darkest up against the glass itself, and then as it comes away, lightening the pressure to the edge here. And I'm going to do the same thing on this other side. Darkest area right here under the light. And then there's a little bit of reflected light there. And then this comes up, same thing. And I always want to keep noticing that I've got it symmetrical on both sides. So I don't want to have a crooked shadow under this or it won't look realistic. Because we know that the vase is symmetrical. So we have to replicate that in our drawing. If we make it lopsided, it's not going to look right. So I'm going in with my darkest darks here, shading away, less pressure as I get further away and go into the general shadow, leaving that little bit of highlight there. And I don't want this to be a hard edge on either side here. So lightest light in the whole picture right here and this. Now underneath that, I want you to squint again at your reference picture and look that even the lightest part of this shadow is darker than that highlight. So that means I go in here very lightly, but it's got to be darker than that for it to be realistic. And then I'm just very lightly going to carry this shadow on down, and you'll see how I'm holding my pencil again flat, so the lead is laying practically right on the paper as I'm doing this. And then it just starts to disappear away as it goes away from the... Because it's denser on the sides, it shows a little bit more along the edge of the shadow than it does in the middle. Because there's a hard edge here, we're seeing more in the shadow. There's nothing really here, it's just reflecting light through that glass. So I'm going to go in and just very lightly kind of fade that away. And remember to keep squinting. It's probably darker than what you're doing it. You got to get brave down here and really look at your picture. Squint down on it and see that this shadow is actually darker. Whoops, I kind of went out of the line. That's okay. I can fix that with an eraser and clean that edge up. I want to be sure that my whole shadow is darker than the vase. Even though it's reflected there, and I can always go back in and lighten it with an eraser if I need to, but I want to be sure that this shadow is dark enough. So be brave. That's a big part of why artists can make things look so real, is they notice how much contrast there is. And it's very common that when you're beginning as an artist, you stay kind of safe and you don't commit to those really dark shadows and values. And that is really what's going to pop your pieces, is that high contrast. So I'm going in to just clean up that edge a little bit again. I want to remember the shapes of those two shadows and not get away from that too much, because whether or not we understand why it looks like that, it doesn't matter. If you don't replicate it as you see it, it is not going to look like the real thing. So be an observer. How are we looking? We're getting pretty close there. All right, now one other thing, the eraser I showed you in the beginning, this is a kneaded eraser, literally because you can knead it while you're working on it. So as you work it and manipulate it, it cleans the graphite out and it will give you a clean surface to work on. So if you need to go back into something, say this highlight under here coming through, I can actually shape the eraser and go in and have really finite control over where I want to lighten just a little bit of that highlight there. Then I may want to go back in with my tortillon or your Q-tip, whatever you're using to blend with, and just get a nice smooth blend on what I just drew there. Now remember, these highlights all the way underneath here are not as light. So if your highlights down here are still too light, squint your eyes down, double check it. Make sure you are comparing all the time. You want them to be light, but not as light as what's coming through the glass. And then of course a shadow generally is pretty soft. So we are pretty much finished. This is your first lesson in how to see. And I hope you have gotten a different perspective. We took a very, very simple shape and we broke it down into shapes and value. We have some broken lines here to just suggest the lip of this vase. And we looked at where things were lightest and where they were darkest, and we went in and replicated it. And I hope you have learned something about how to see as an artist, how to see the shapes in it, how to connect the shapes, how to add the value to give it form, and you are well on your way to being able to draw with realism. Thank you for joining us today for a fun art with Lisa in the studio. We have lots more classes, and I hope we'll see you again soon. Thank you.